So, from the Spanish American War, the U.S. definitely is now moving into a more global and more imperialist power. The U.S. has now acquired Hawaii, and then through the Spanish American War, the U.S. has taken over Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Cuba. And again, this is causing a lot of controversy within the territory's population, like which national identity do they relate to. It caused a lot of conflict and kind of a lot of hypocrisy about our foreign policy because a lot of people in America, again, are not supportive of this imperialist foreign policy. However, after the Spanish American War, where Teddy Roosevelt became a nationally known figure and was seen as a hero, President McKinley then ran with him in the 1900 election, and Teddy Roosevelt became vice president. And then we already covered and know that President McKinley ends up getting assassinated, and Teddy Roosevelt now is president. So we're quickly just going to cover Teddy, Taft, and Wilson's foreign policies because we already did cover their domestic policies in the progressive era. So we want to kind of take a turn and see what they're promoting with foreign policy. Now, the fact that Roosevelt is a Republican, Roosevelt definitely is supportive of imperialism. Teddy Roosevelt is going to push imperialism, and we're going to see this in what he ends up nicknaming his big stick policy. Now, Teddy Roosevelt and the big stick policy, he basically had this famous quote where he said, "We will speak softly and carry a big stick." Basically, meaning that we're going to try to negotiate. We're going to definitely try to work with people. But if you don't do what we like, or if you don't do what we say, we basically are going to threaten you. Like, imagine someone walking around telling you what to do, carrying a big baseball bat. He's basically trying to use threat and trying to use force as a way to manipulate countries to do what he wants. So the big stick policy is very aggressive. It's definitely not what we would see the U.S. We really never have seen the U.S. have a foreign policy this aggressive. Definitely against Washington and his isolationist ideas. And so with Teddy Roosevelt, he's really trying to push the U.S. into this superpower. Now, with the big stick policy, we're going to see him actually intervene in quite a few areas. And he's actually going to try to enforce U.S. policy. One of the ways he enforces this policy is with the Roosevelt Corollary. Now, the Roosevelt Corollary, all that means, corollary basically means like an addition. This is specifically an addition to the Monroe Doctrine. Remember, the Monroe Doctrine in 1823 said that foreign countries cannot colonize in the Western Hemisphere, that the U.S. would intervene if European countries tried to colonize in the Western Hemisphere. So, what the Roosevelt Corollary said was that it basically added to the Monroe Doctrine that the U.S. has the right to also intervene in Western Hemisphere policies, like basically domestic policies. The Roosevelt Corollary basically stated that the U.S. was like the police force of the Western Hemisphere. That if the U.S. doesn't like something that's happening in Central America or South America, that the U.S. can use military force to basically enforce the U.S. policy. So the Monroe Doctrine was to try to protect the West. The Roosevelt Corollary is basically saying if you do something that we don't like, we're going to intervene with our military. And so this actually happened. We saw this practice actually with Panama. The United States ended up basically taking over the construction of the Panama Canal from the French. And Panama, though, was controlled by Colombia. Colombia had ownership over Panama, and we definitely saw that there were issues because Colombia was reluctant to allow the U.S. into Panama to dig this canal. But with Teddy Roosevelt and the United States military force, the U.S. ended up pushing an independence movement in Panama. And the U.S. basically guided Panama in having an independent movement and becoming separated from Colombia. Now, once the U.S. basically said, we helped you, you basically you owe us now that we helped you become independent, then the U.S. decided now we're going to build a canal through the country. Now, the Panama Canal is one of the biggest human engineering projects of the time. It happened a few decades after the Suez Canal was created. And the Panama Canal basically is connecting the Pacific to the Atlantic in a much, much, much faster way. Um, Not only is this going to help with trade, it's also going to help with military. Think about Teddy's perspective. He just fought in the Spanish American War, where we had to move our Navy from the Philippines to Cuba. We had to go from the Pacific to the Caribbean, and it took months. And so now with the Panama Canal, it's going to drastically shorten the time for military to move, but it's also going to drastically shorten the time for trade. And that's really the biggest reason the Panama Canal is going to really help with trade routes. Now, according to the Panama Canal, according to the treaties we made with Panama, the U.S. is going to own the Panama Canal for 100 years. This canal gets finished in 1914, and the U.S. is set to own it until 2014. Now, with that being said, yes, the United States paid for the infrastructure, paid for the construction of the Panama Canal, but mainly a lot of Panamanians built this canal and it's in their country. So there is this issue about the canal because this is a huge moneymaker. Every boat that goes through that canal has to pay. They have to pay a toll. And so the Panama Canal, with the U.S. intervening in policy, we definitely see the Panama Canal being one of those issues where the U.S. is imperializing and definitely manipulating other countries. I'll upload the link for you to watch because the Panama Canal is pretty amazing to see how it works because it's basically like an elevator made by water. So moving on to Taft. Taft's policy, and here's Teddy Roosevelt with his big stick in Panama, trying to basically manipulate and threaten them to do what he wants. Taft's policy is much more simpler. Taft's policy is going to be called dollar diplomacy. And with dollar diplomacy, Taft is basically saying, I don't want to use threat, I don't want to use force, let's just use money. So Taft's dollar diplomacy basically wants American business and American banks to invest in Latin America and in Asia. And this is pretty typical of U.S. policy. The U.S. definitely invests in other countries and then basically says these countries now have to give the U.S. a cut of the profit. We'll do this in countries like Iran. We do this in countries pretty much all over the world where we help them develop infrastructure for oil or whatever resources. And then we say, okay, now, you owe us, we get a cut of the profit. So dollar diplomacy is less aggressive, but definitely intervening. And the last one is Wilson's moral diplomacy. Wilson's moral diplomacy, again, Wilson, remember, is a Democrat, so he is anti imperialist. He basically just says that the U.S. should focus on allying with democratic countries and that the U.S. should promote democracy. We shouldn't use force. We shouldn't use any aggression, but we should help promote democracy. So Wilson's foreign policy is mainly going to have to deal with World War I because World War I is brewing over in Europe. But he will have some issues dealing with Mexico and the revolution in Mexico with Pancho Villa, where Wilson refuses to get involved. Because again, Wilson is an isolationist. He actually won his re-election by saying we stayed out of war. He kept us out of war. And ironically, right after he got reelected, we are going to enter World War I.